and we're going to get into it. So thank you so much for being here, the two of you. I will go ahead and read your bios because I want to just make sure that everybody knows who you are as a poet, as a writer, before we dive into the bigger conversation, okay? Born in Riverside, California, Deborah D.E.E.P. Mouton is an internationally recognized performance poet and the first African-American poet laureate of Houston, Texas. Formerly ranked #2 female performance poet in the world, she is a founding member and executive director of VIP Arts Houston, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting literacy and the arts in underserved populations. Her genre-bending poetry has engendered unconventional collaborations with groups as disparate as the Houston Rockets and the Houston Ballet. Her work has been featured on NPR, the BBC, and the TEDx circuit. Her debut recent collection, Newsworthy, which I bought after hearing her speak at a recent event and is just wonderful, wrestles with living in a culture infected by white supremacy, where current media is distrusted, cursory, and impossible to escape. She lives and teaches in Houston. Please welcome Deborah. We're gonna clap, clap, clap.
Hi, everyone.
In our chat. So thank you so much for being here, and glad to have you. Glad to have this conversation. And then our second author for our panel, Sasha West's first book, Failure and I, Bury the Body, was published by Harper Perennial and was a winner of the National Poetry Series, the Texas Institute of Letters First Book of Poetry Award, and a Breadloaf Writers Conference Fellowship. And I also can say that it is wonderful. Her poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Kenyon Review Online, Agni, Georgia Review, Copper Nickel, and elsewhere. She's an associate professor of creative writing at St. Edward's University, where she received the Distinguished Teaching Award. Please welcome Sasha West. Yay. So that's great. Those are your bios. But, you know, we're here today to talk about poetry, and I would love for each of you to start by just telling us, you know, when I think of poetry, I think of it as a reader. I love it. But I also think to myself, I can't do that. And I would just love to hear, as you know, as writers, how did you come to this genre? How did you come to poetry, and give yourself permission to do something that I think a lot of us find really unreachable in some ways. Am I saying that incorrectly? But I just think there's something about poetry that is very, just feels like bigger than all of us. So I'm going to start with you, Deborah. What brought you to poetry?
I wish I could answer that. I've been writing since I was a very young child. You know, my mom has poems that I wrote when I was 5. So I think my mom just always surrounded me, my parents both did, with libraries in every room, and kind of just saturated me with literature. And so poetry just, at some point in time, somewhere, felt like a really natural click for me. But I think a better question probably for me is why I stayed with poetry, you know, why we didn't break up at some point in time. And I think I've always been a collector of moments, and I've always really wanted to herald like the very small things. And I always notice things and remember things in really minute spaces and things that people didn't notice before. And as I started to write them out, poetry just lent itself more to being able to live in the moment.
I love that phrase, collector of moments. That's cool. Sasha, how about you?
I too started writing really little, and I think it was for the same reason. My parents loved poetry, especially my mom. And so I just had all of these experiences as a reader, like those moments of sort of, oh, how could you possibly do that formally? Like what happened there? But also definitely a feeling, especially as I was moving into being a teen and a young adult, that poetry was a place that helped me make sense of the world. Like other writers helped me see things that I didn't have a name for. And I think I just started writing because I wanted to do that. And it took me a really long time to realize it was the thing that I wanted to do in the world, because I'd been doing it so long as a human that I was just like, oh, I could also have a career in this. Could also be the thing that I am publicly. Yeah.
And I love this. I'm so glad to be talking to you guys. So the first question that we've gotten in the chat box is actually what I was going to ask you next, and that is also that poetry has so many different forms, and there are so many different ways as a poet you can express yourself. So I guess I'll go ahead and phrase it the way that Emily has. How purposeful have you been in choosing your poetic form? Is there a point as a poet where someone sits you down, the poet master, and says, here are all the different forms. You'll be doing haiku, you'll be doing I can't name them, sonnets, what have you. How did you come up with the forms that were going to that work for your voice? Sasha, I'm looking at you, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, just making sure that my headphone microphone is working. I think that changes for me poem by poem, because I feel like different material calls for different forms. So like the poems that are in my first book, they're rangier and stranger and more experimental and a lot rougher because they're dealing with failure. So making them really neat and perfect just didn't make sense. And in this book, this manuscript that I just finished working on about climate change, it's way more direct than anything I've ever written, because it feels like there's so much obfuscation in language around the issue. Like people are often trying to hide so many things. And so being more experimental, using fractured syntax felt like it would not do what I wanted to do, which is really come to terms with something, look at it straight on, and say the hardest, truest thing that I could. And so for me, it has really helped to read a lot of different writers doing lots of different things, so that I feel like when I start a poem or when I start a project, I can be thinking about what form is going to call out of me the kinds of ideas and language that will best serve these poems. So I don't have a set answer. Like I do not sit down and think I am going to write a sonnet or anything, or I'm going to write a really long line. It's just sort of, it starts and then I'm looking around. Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. And I just came out of the general fiction session where in some ways they answered in a similar way. They don't say, I'm going to write historical, I'm going to write science fiction. They have something they want to share, and it just becomes the category that it's going to become. So what about you, Deborah? How do you think about that?
Well, so my background kind of came from being on stage, which I think does something really different for my editing process. And so I find form a lot of the time enters in my editing. I may have an idea that I'm kind of fleshing out, and as I'm going forward, I'm like, you know what? Something is not working about this, and it almost like needs a new outfit, right? And how can we dress it differently? And so a lot of times I'll write the same poem 4 or 5 different times in different forms until I feel like I've really landed on what I was trying to convey. I think also being able to just play sometimes. I take a lot of workshops where different forms are thrown in as possible experimental things, and I do a lot of research that way. And so I don't think there was ever like a master class that sat me down and kind of instructed me on all things, like imputed into me all things poetry. I think just over the years of being able to kind of like play with my words and figure out exactly what they wanted to say has given me kind of the freedom to be able to be familiar enough that when something wants to come out, I know how to address it.
Well, and I'd love to stay with you for a second and talk about that entry point of doing poetry as performance, and kind of what that, I don't know, maybe just what you would say to poets who haven't done that, to whether they should give it a try, what you got from it that you think could be really valuable for folks who haven't done it before, and then maybe even just what tools in your poet's toolbox you needed for that expression versus written and not performed poetry.
Absolutely. I think one of the greatest gifts that being a performer in slam or just as a performance poet has given me is this really deep connection with my audience. I think a lot of times poets write kind of in a silo and then share, and those two are very different experiences, where when I'm writing, I'm thinking about the idea of sharing it, which for some people that's too much pressure and they're like, I don't want to know what anybody would ever think of this. But it actually does some really great things in me figuring out how to layer the work. And so I always think of, do I want this to be something that people revisit over and over and over again in text and can live with the subtleties of, is it here H-E-R-E or is it here H-E-A-R? And can I play with those things, right? Or is it something that I want to be kind of an arrow to the chest that's this first impact, this first moment with it is going to be this impactful moment that just the sting lingers for a long time and brings you back to the work in the way that a performance does. And so I would say, poetry in and of itself as a form started off as an oral tradition. And so all poems, I think, are meant to be read aloud. I think it's just a matter of how you want to do that.
And Sasha, do you have anything to add about the performance side of being a poet?
I really agree with that idea of it being aloud. I mean, I read poems obsessively aloud when I'm writing them, which, I'm more aware of that now that everybody's home all the time, because I'm like, I'm talking to myself a lot, but it's doing work, it's testing. It's testing the line against the music of it. It's thinking about the audience, because I definitely do I start writing in a silo often, but that's to figure out what I want to say. And then once I know what I want to say, I'm not going to publish it. I'm not going to read it if I don't want it to reach someone. And it's going to have to reach them through my voice, because how I understand that voice is going to change how I lineate it on the page. It's going to change what it looks like. It's going to change the words that I choose. So yeah, I just think I've been thinking a lot about how musical poetry is. I mean, I write mostly in free verse. So for me, like, the music is not coming out of some given rhyme scheme. But it's coming out of this sense of, like, we as a species care about music. Like, every single culture in the world that has recorded history has cared about music. And I think one of the tools that we really have as poets is we get to have all of the storytelling and we get to have all of the truth telling, but there also is a way that we are negotiating with sound and we're negotiating with pacing. And it's just so much easier to hear that when you're thinking about it moving through a mouth than when you're thinking about it moving through, like, little scratches on a page. So yeah, I deeply agree with that.
So sticking with just going back to a word you just used, which is voice, I would just be curious for both of you how you find your voice as a poet. And I know that sounds like a really not specific question, and I apologize, but what does that mean to you? Like, what is your voice, Sasha West, and how did you find it? Same question to you, Deborah.
Yeah, I think maybe because I'm thinking a lot about this through teaching and my students, that there's a way, I mean, you already have a voice. Like, there are exercises that we do where we do sort of translations of something, or we all write about the same thing. And even when it's something as literal as change every single word in a Shakespeare sonnet to its opposite, everybody chooses something different. Like, you can set up the most structured kind of contained space, and people will be themselves. And so I think that for me, like, I believe that the voice is innate. I feel like the more interesting question is not how you're necessarily developing how you sound, but how you're developing how you see. Because I think it's really about, like, you can only see certain things in the world. Like, your life experience is going to lead you to make different patterns and observe different things and feel different things and be a different collector of moments than anyone else. And you can work on the craft of how that sounds when you're getting it to an audience, but that's the space that I urge my students to focus on. Like, it is an active attention, and you can learn the craft pieces, and you can spend a lot of time with it and find the right words and learn those pieces. But, like, the voice is really, who are you as an observing eye? What can you see and say that no one else can see and say?
Love it. How about you, Deborah?
Yeah, I love that idea of teaching or looking at the way that you see things. I absolutely agree with Sasha in that. I think for me, my journey was a little bit different just because I came from stage. I did workshops when I remember 15 years old, driving to LA, because I grew up in California, and driving in and doing workshops and people saying, you sound like everyone else. And I kind of sat with that, and it really hurt my feelings at times, because I was like, but I sound like myself. But the reality is, we all come to our craft mimicking in some ways the people who we're reading, the people who we're influenced by. And so there was a point in which I had to really be intentional about transitioning from mimicking someone else's voice to really listening to my own. And now, even as I'm writing, there's times when I say that sounds too much like me, and I need to refresh, right? Like, I need it to sound different. I need it to not just sound like my voice. And honestly, my work in fiction has helped me be able to break some of that, because being able to build characters and think about the rules of how I'm differentiating one character to another has helped me be really, really intentional about the voice that I'm using for each and every.
Oh, I love that. So I want to ask each of you how you start. So where, often for fiction writers, we talk about outlining, we talk about, pantsing or not pantsing, or whatever the other expression is. I don't pay attention, but what for you as a poet, how do you start, and how do you approach developing that piece? Deborah, I'm looking at you now.
Yeah, I'll start word vomit. That's really where I can start, is just like getting it out of your body. I think that a lot of times that's the hardest part. I think that editing is a brilliant tool that is underused, right? And that once you get it out of you, you can start to shape it. It's kind of like getting clay on a wheel, right? And then you can start to really do with it what it needs to do. But until you're willing to kind of like open that up and get those emotions out on a piece of paper, you can't really know what it is. And I oftentimes find myself in that kind of purging moment of realizing that I felt about things ways that I didn't realize that I felt until they were on the page. And so I think that that's the first step.
All right. Sasha?
Yeah, the writing is a tool of thinking. I just agree with that. That it is that I don't know what I'm doing until I'm in the middle of it. That if I try to plan too much ahead of time, usually I kill the poem. I every once in a while will sort of get a phrase stuck in my head. Like I was working on a poem a couple of months ago that started, I borrowed despair. And I was really interested. I was like, why is it borrowed? Like, why would anybody borrow despair? And I think it was because I was thinking about my mom saying, don't borrow trouble. And I'm like, I don't think I'm borrowing trouble. I think I'm borrowing despair. But just getting really curious about that. Like once something sticks or once something is on the page, just getting really curious about why I thought that, or why that felt like a surprise to me, and digging into that place, digging into the place that I didn't know that I knew something, that I'm saying something that really kind of shocks me. Like that's usually the most fruitful writing for me. Yeah, because I love the thing that you were saying, Deborah, about sometimes you write something and you're like, it sounds too much like me. Like I know these beats, I recognize this. And usually that if you follow that, it can make for a perfect poem, like a really polished poem that other people are really going to like, but that you kind of know is a performance of poetry,
Yes.
like, and not in a good performance way, like just the kind of going through the motions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of a process of how do you get past what you already know how to do, or what you already know how to see. Yeah.
So I want to ask you just briefly, can you talk a little bit about what the process is for poets for getting their work out into the world? Because I imagine that it's also different from if we're thinking about fiction or memoir and other types of writing, in that there are contests, there are journals, there are other things. Can you just speak a little bit on what that looks like on the sort of business side of things for getting your poetry published? Deborah.
Okay. I was like, who's going?
I know.
I'm waiting.
Right?
I'm trying to make eye contact, but I realize I'm making eye contact with both of you.
Yeah, we don't know. We don't know who you're saying.
I love social cues on video. It's great, right? So I would say, there's a million ways to get your work out. And I think it just depends on what you want out of the work. I think an easy way that we all know kind of is to throw things on social media. That's, kind of the easiest way, right? I am not really a fan of that one, but that's just because as you get into traditional publishing, a lot of people don't want to publish things that have been out in the world in blogs and in social media posts and things like that. So if you kind of want just this immediate response to your work, social media is really great. And if you want something that's more along the lines of traditional publishing, there are contests, there are calls that you can answer, and submissions. Submittable is great for that. Poets and Writers is great for that. And so that's the kind of the easy way. I think when you start getting into a manuscript and into a collection, there are other things that kind of enter as far as, a lot of times poetry books and manuscripts don't really hold an agent the same way that a fiction book would. And so I think that there's tricks of the trade once you get to those larger works. But in general, I think that there's a lot of really great ways to get kind of a single piece or a couple pieces placed in magazines.
And that's kind of the association, right? That you will start with journal publications or other, getting a single piece out before you don't really jump straight to often a collection. Sasha, what do you have to add about sort of the way that part of the world works?
I will say, I wish I had an agent. That'd be so nice. I'd love to have somebody. I would definitely pay somebody else to do this work.
Right.
One of the things that I did a lot when I was younger was look at where the people that I loved were published, where the contemporary writers were. Like when I read a book that I loved, still, I will go to the acknowledgements page and I will see, where were you publishing? And I think I would definitely agree with Deborah that you need to think about what you want from it, because sometimes there are poems I will only read to my mother, and like, that's it. That's super satisfying. I read it to my mom. Sometimes I'll read it to my mom and my husband, and then there's pieces that I think I want this to live in a larger public way. And what does that mean for me? Right now, because I have this manuscript, I'm thinking about what journals will make me visible to the publishers that I want to be visible to. But there are other times where I'm thinking about, how do I reach readers that I didn't reach with the first book? Where are the dialogues that are happening that are really interesting in poetry right now? Like, who are the editors that I'm really excited about, who are introducing me to new writers that I love? And then the other piece that I feel like I wish someone had told me when I was starting is that part of publishing is getting really, really good at knowing what rejection means. And I think if you're trying to publish too early, then rejection probably does mean you need to do more work. Like, you need to talk to more people, you need to take workshops, you need to read more deeply, you need to spend more time revising. But I think that there's a point where, rejection just starts meaning something really different. And you can be writing amazing poems and they won't be taken everywhere, right? Like the biggest poem that I published last year in a journal I had been trying for 15 years to break into, when I went back this summer to do like my annual report for the university, it was rejected so many other places, and a lot of them were a lot smaller and percentage wise should have been a lot easier to get in too, but it was just not a good fit for them. And somebody once told me about a talk they were listening to because they'd gotten a Creative Capital grant, which is like a really hard grant to get. It's really talented people. And the person coming and talking to this crazy talented, already celebrated group of people was saying, if you are not being rejected from 90% of what you're applying for, you are not doing your job as an artist. And like, they're saying that to writers that are ahead of me, right? So I'm like, so probably I should be rejected from like 95%. And it's part of it. Like, it is just part of it. And so don't take that no in and think, do I need to do more? Be really honest about that. But then at some point, like, the no does not mean you shouldn't be publishing. It means you should be sending it out more.
Mm-hmm.
Sasha, you don't have to come for me personally in this. We were supposed to be on one side, not against each other. Like, now I feel like I need to go submit my work more.
You should. Yes, you should. I should too. Like, I am behind. I'm not hitting my 95% mark, but it's aspirational.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're here to teach. I love it. Well, I would love to hear and I know I think there are probably a lot of folks in the room who are fans of poetry and love reading and also discovering new poets. And so, other than the fact that I can say I'm pretty sure that they've discovered, if they didn't know one or both of you before this, they are probably really excited to go find your collections right after this. But who are the poets? Can you give us a couple of poets that you would recommend, or who have meant something as a poet to you specifically, and why? Sasha.
Okay, I'm ready. Yeah. Okay. So recently, the people that I've been going back to a lot are Natalie Diaz. I love her first book so much. I've taught it so many times, and every year I'm like, do I take it out of rotation this year? And I'm like, no, I don't want to. And part of it is because she's so fearless in what she wants to do in terms of form, and she just grapples with such difficult materials in ways that create these amazing poems and these amazing experiences. And so I have been going back to her a lot, and I just got her new book, and I've been like rationing the poems like one at a time because she doesn't publish super frequently in terms of books, and so I want it to last. I go back to Victoria Chang's The Boss a lot for her lineation, and I just finished her new book Obit, and it is amazing. And then I just started Maya Phillips's Eru, where she's wrestling with the Odyssey and sort of her own family history, and it is blowing my mind. So those are the contemporary poets. I think going back, Emily Dickinson, not in sort of the neat little happy ways that she's taught in school, but the ways that she explodes what it is to care about something in the world, and sort of like all of the ways that her life is being unpacked across my lifetime are really interesting to me. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Who was the third poet you mentioned? You mentioned
Maya Phillips. Maya Phillips, Eru, E-R-O-U, out from Four-Way last year. Okay. And it is a stunning, stunning book.
E-R-O-U.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Deborah, how about you?
Yeah, so I can probably go on for eons, just like Sasha, so I'll try to limit it. I would say I started with, kind of more Black classical, Harlem Renaissance, Langston Hughes, and then kind of bridging into the 60s and looking at like Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez, which are always going to be some of my favorites. As far as contemporaries go, Patricia Smith is probably like one of my top people to read. And even before Incendiary Art, when she was actually in the performance world, I was listening to her, and to see her make the transition to something that was more traditional publishing was kind of unheard of at the time from our side of it. And so to kind of see her bridge in that way was inspiring and really, really just exciting to see. I would say, who else am I reading right now? I was like, why? I had this whole list, and then I started talking, and then they all disappeared. I love Claudia Rankine, even though some people may not consider her a poet. I would totally consider her a poet. And I think that I learned how to work in prose with her. I don't know that I really knew the line that prose could serve for poetry in that situation. And so I would say her. Terrence Hayes, oh my goodness, Terrence Hayes. His language is just beautiful. So I would put Terrence Hayes there. And I'm going to stop there because I can just ramble.
Now, this is going to put you guys on the spot a little bit, and I sent you private chats, but you did not see them. So I'm just going to
saw it, but I didn't know who it was from because I was trying to look and keep eyes.
Okay, so, I'm going back.
Yeah, sure. Let me put you a little bit on the spot and just say, before we go into our breakout rooms, I wonder if either of you would be willing to just read a bit of something of your own work, because I think folks would probably really appreciate hearing that. But if that feels like you're being put too much on the spot, just like turn off your video. No.
Walk away, run with our heads down.
How do you feel about that?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay, cool. All right. So I would love to. I think folks would really appreciate it. So Deborah, I'm going to let you go first.
Sure. I'll read a short piece that's actually from my most recent collection, Newsworthy, which you'll see like a picture of right here.
Yeah, it's a great jacket. Yeah.
I just try to keep it around, All right. And this is called Sanford Sweet. I remember the iced tea we used to brew on my mother's back porch just outside her garden. How it steeped against the ground till deep-seated. How the sticky, sweet Alabama honey stuck to our everywhere. I wonder how hard they had to scrub to get the Trayvon off. Was it calm George, calling it in? Dream of paradise under Arizona rainbow, sepia ignorant bliss. Whisper under breath, if we stack flowers at every site, this world can be Eden again. I stand here in the wilderness of kitchen, The linoleum tiles a dry bubbling beneath my bare feet. Our nursery is quiet tonight for all the right reasons. The eerie of Crib Mobile plays soundtrack to a muted television. Over a casket of fruit spoiling before a bite. Under crescendo of kettle, in the most shameful whisper, say, I'm so glad we had a girl.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. It was beautiful.
Thank you.
And that is in Newsworthy, right?
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
They exist everywhere, all over the room.
All right. Sasha West, would you like to share a little bit of one of your poems with us too?
Sure. I don't usually do this, but since it's a meetup and not like an official panel, I'm gonna read the poem that I was talking about, the recent piece. I borrowed despair, rubbed it between my fingers until they turned dark with the ink of the oceans. I borrowed despair, gave it mouth to mouth after it sank to the bottom of the pool. Its mouth was a wet summer, its mouth hung with bear fur. I loved it more than me. I wish it were metaphorical, then I could make it into a femur or tumbleweed to snap. But I borrowed despair, and it lived in my house, and I never gave it back.
Thank you. You guys, the two of you. I feel so lucky that we got to listen to you talk today. And